She sat on the same wooden bench every morning, her small frame wrapped in a faded shawl that had seen many winters. The park was alive with movement, children running after pigeons, dogs tugging impatiently at their leashes, joggers moving swiftly past, but she remained still, almost as though she were part of the landscape. I had noticed her countless times, and though she seemed ordinary to most, there was something about the way she held herself that made me linger. Her gaze was never hurried. It carried the softness of someone who had lived through years and gathered stories the way trees gather rings. At first, I thought she was waiting for someone. Her eyes often searched the pathways, following strangers as if she expected one of them to stop and recognize her. But no one did. People passed her by without a glance, too wrapped in their own lives to notice the old woman alone with her notebook. I felt a strange pull toward her, though I did not approach. There was a quiet dignity in her solitude that made me hesitate, as if speaking too soon would break something fragile. Every so often, I would catch a glimpse of her writing. Her hands, delicate yet steady, moved slowly across the page. She would then pause, look up at the trees, and close her eyes, as if listening for words carried on the wind. Sometimes she smiled faintly to herself. Other times she grew distant, her expression shadowed by a sadness I could not name. I wondered what she wrote, what kind of thoughts filled her pages. The world around her rarely paused to wonder. Children's laughter echoed, joggers passed, conversations fluttered around, but none of it seemed to touch her. And yet, in that quiet corner of the park, she carried an air of presence more powerful than the busiest crowd. It was as though she belonged to another rhythm, slower, deeper, one that asked for patience. I found myself returning more often, not for the park itself, but for her. It was curiosity at first, a simple need to understand why she came here every day with her notebook. But beneath that curiosity grew something else, something softer. It was the sense that she was waiting, not just for someone to sit beside her, but for someone willing to listen. And though I had not yet spoken a word to her, I felt as if she had already begun to tell me a story, one that could not be rushed, one that asked me to be still. The first time I heard her voice, it was so soft that I thought she was speaking to herself. I had sat on the bench across from hers, pretending to read a book while sneaking glances at her. She looked up, her eyes meeting mine briefly, and then she began to speak, not to me directly, but into the air, as though telling the park itself her story. Her words floated gently, describing the small details of her morning walk, how the air smelled of wet grass after dawn, how the trees seemed to whisper secrets if one stood still long enough. At first, I thought it was nothing more than idle musing, but as she continued, her tone shifted, and I realized she was telling a story from her past. She spoke of a little boy who used to run across this same park, his laughter carrying like music. She described his small hands, sticky with melted candy, and the way he would tug at her sleeve to show her a flower he had picked. Her voice trembled slightly when she said his name, and though she did not explain what had become of him, the silence that followed was enough for me to understand. The boy no longer came to the park, and perhaps had not for many years. I felt a weight in my chest, as though I had been invited into a sacred place. She turned her head toward me, and for the first time, spoke directly. "You remind me of someone who used to listen," she said, her eyes both tender and searching. Something in me softened, and I closed my book, realizing I could no longer pretend. From that day, I began to sit closer, sometimes even beside her. She would open her notebook, glance at her scribbled words, and begin to share pieces of her life. Some stories were simple childhood games, her days as a school teacher, the way her late husband used to whistle while he cooked. Others were heavier losses she had endured, mistakes she had carried, regrets she whispered as though they were too fragile to speak aloud. Most people still walked by, indifferent. Yet with each story, I began to see her differently. She was not merely an old woman passing time. She was a keeper of memories, a guardian of moments that might otherwise disappear into silence. Listening to her became less of a choice and more of a need, as though each word she gave was a thread weaving something new inside me. She never asked for advice or pity. All she wanted was a listener, and in giving her that, I found myself receiving more than I could have expected. Her stories carried sorrow, yes, but also a beauty that lingered, like the fading warmth of sunlight after the day has ended. One afternoon, the air felt heavier than usual. The sky was pale gray, and the trees seemed restless, their branches swaying as if they too were uneasy. She sat in her usual spot, but her notebook remained closed on her lap. When I joined her, she gave me a faint smile that carried both warmth and weariness. "Today," she said, "I want to tell you the story I've never written down." Her hands trembled slightly as she folded them together, her gaze fixed on the distance as though she were looking beyond the park, beyond time itself. She spoke of her younger years, when she had dreams of traveling the world, of writing books filled with all the stories she imagined. But life had steered her differently, teaching, raising a family, caring for others while her own dreams quietly faded. She told me how she used to promise herself that one day she would begin, but years passed, and that day never seemed to arrive. Her voice grew softer as she revealed her secret. "I come here," she said, "because I am afraid of disappearing, not from the world, but from memory. If no one hears these stories, then what was all this life for?" She looked at me then, her eyes filled with both fear and hope, as if the answer rested in my silence. I wanted to reassure her, to tell her that she mattered, that her words already lived within me, but instead, I simply listened, because I knew that was what she needed most. For a long moment, we sat together in the quiet hum of the park, her truth hanging in the air like something sacred. The days after that, I continued to meet her, but one morning her bench was empty. At first, I thought I had simply missed her, but as days turned into weeks, I began to realize she would not return. The park felt different without her, as though the air itself carried her absence. Then, one morning, I noticed a worn notebook placed carefully on the bench where she used to sit. I opened it with trembling hands and found her stories written in her delicate script. Some I had heard, others were new, but each page carried her voice, her laughter, her sorrow. At the very end, a single line waited for me. "For the one who listened, thank you for keeping me alive." I closed the notebook and held it tightly, realizing her stories were now mine to carry. She had not vanished, not truly. Her words had taken root, and through them, she had found the immortality she longed for. As I left the park that day, the world seemed different, softer. Her presence lingered in the rustle of the leaves, in the laughter of children, in the quiet spaces where stories wait to be told. And I knew, with a certainty that felt unshakable, that listening is sometimes the greatest gift we can give. There are stories around us every day, often carried quietly by those we overlook. The old woman at the park reminded me that life's true value is not in the grand moments, but in the memories we dare to share and the ears willing to listen. We all hold a secret worth hearing, and sometimes, all it takes is a single listener to keep a life alive beyond its years. If this story touched you, take a moment to like, share, and leave your reflections below. And remember to subscribe for more heartfelt stories that linger long after they end.